August 1943, over the Pacific Ocean, west of Hawaii. At first, the Japanese pilots think it's another Wildcat. The silhouette looks familiar enough. Broad wings, heavy fuselage, slow roll rate. Nothing to fear, nothing that should survive long in a turning fight. They roll in confidently. And then something goes wrong. The American fighter does not bleed speed. It does not stagger under fire. It does not break away when hit. Instead, it keeps coming, faster than expected, steadier than anything the Zero has faced before. The Japanese pilots fire. They see strikes. They expect flames. None appear. The American aircraft dives through them, guns blazing, then pulls away, climbing hard, impossibly hard, back into altitude the Zero cannot match. Within seconds, the engagement is over, and something new has entered the war. By late 1943, reports like this are spreading across Japanese air units from the Solomons to the Central Pacific. Pilots describe an American fighter that will not die, that absorbs punishment and keeps fighting. A fighter that does not need to turn tightly to win. Its name begins appearing in intelligence summaries. F6F Hellcat. To American commanders, the Hellcat is not a surprise, it is a response. For nearly 2 years, the Pacific Air War has been defined by painful lessons. Early encounters with the Japanese Zero taught the U.S. Navy exactly what not to build. Lightweight, fragile aircraft optimized for turning fights at the cost of survivability. Too many pilots had paid for that lesson with their lives. The Hellcat is designed with that knowledge burned into its blueprints. It is bigger than the Zero, heavier, less elegant, but it is built to kill and survive. 6 50 caliber machine guns, armor plating around the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, a massive Pratt & Whitney engine producing brutal, reliable power. And most importantly, it is designed around pilot survival first. American engineers assume pilots will be hit. The aircraft is built to bring them home anyway. Japanese pilots feel the difference immediately. Hits that would have ignited a Wildcat or shattered a P-40 now do nothing. Tracer rounds spark off armor. Fuel tanks seal themselves. The Hellcat keeps flying. And when the Hellcat attacks, it does so on its own terms. It dives faster than the Zero, climbs better at combat speeds, retains energy, and refuses to turn unless it chooses to. Japanese pilots had grown used to dictating fights. Now the Americans are doing the choosing. The balance of the Pacific Air War has not yet tipped, but it is no longer stable. And the pilots who understand that first will live. The F6F Hellcat does not emerge from theory. It emerges from wreckage. By 1942, the U.S. Navy has lost too many pilots to misunderstandings. About the Zero, about air combat, about what really matters when two aircraft meet at closing speed. Early fighters had tried to match the Zero, to turn like it, to fight the way it fought. That approach failed, so the Navy changes the question. Instead of asking, how do we outfly the Zero? They ask, how do we outlast it? The answer is the Hellcat. Everything about the F6F is shaped by combat reports. Engineers rate accounts from Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea line by line. They note where pilots are hit, how often engines fail, how frequently fires start, what happens when aircraft dive too fast, or too slow. Then they build an airplane that forgives mistakes. The Hellcat's engine is its heart, a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800, delivering more than 2,000 horsepower. It gives the aircraft brutal acceleration in a dive and steady power in a climb, exactly where American pilots need it most. The wings are thick and strong. The fuselage is rugged. The cockpit is wrapped in armor. The fuel tanks seal themselves when punctured. Control cables are duplicated. Damage that would have destroyed a Zero becomes survivable. This is not elegance. It is intent. Japanese pilots immediately notice something unsettling. Their rounds are landing, but the Hellcat keeps flying. The American aircraft does not react the way enemies are supposed to react. And when the Hellcat fires back, the effect is catastrophic. 6 50 caliber machine guns put out a dense wall of fire. Short bursts are enough. The Zero, with its unprotected fuel tanks and lightweight structure, cannot absorb that punishment. Hits ignite fuel. Wings fail. Control surfaces tear away. The engagement times shorten dramatically. For the first time in the war, Japanese pilots begin breaking off attacks not because of positioning, but because of fear of return fire. The Hellcat does not need to win the first turn. It only needs to survive long enough to deliver one clean pass. And it almost always does. American pilots are trained accordingly. They are told not to turn unless necessary, not to chase endlessly, not to bleed energy for pride. The Hellcat allows them to fight disciplined, to attack, disengage, and reset. The Zero cannot do this. Once it commits to a maneuver, it must see it through. Once it loses energy, recovery is slow. Once it is hit, there is often no second chance. By mid-1943, Japanese combat reports quietly acknowledge the change. The Americans are no longer relying on luck or numbers. They are flying an aircraft designed specifically to negate everything the Zero once excelled at. The Hellcat is not faster in every regime. It is not more agile in every maneuver. But it is better where it matters most. And that difference is lethal. The realization comes in fragments, not all at once, not in a single catastrophic battle, but in a series of encounters that leave experienced Japanese pilots unsettled in a way they have not felt since the opening months of the war. Late 1943, the skies over the Central Pacific. A Japanese fighter section climbs to intercept incoming American aircraft. They expect Wildcats or P-40s, fighters they know how to defeat if flown correctly. The pilots spread out, preparing to force turning engagements. Then the Hellcats arrive. At first glance, they look clumsy, broad wings, thick fuselages, not the sleek, knife-edged shape of a Zero. The Japanese pilots press in, confident that agility will decide the fight. It doesn't. The first American fighter dives straight through the formation, firing briefly. A Zero explodes without warning, fuel igniting instantly. Before the Japanese pilots can react, the Hellcat is already gone, pulling up into altitude with speed the Zero cannot match. Another Hellcat follows, then another. The sky fills with vertical motion, dives and climbs instead of circles. Zeros roll and turn, searching for targets that refuse to stay. When they chase, the Americans simply dive again, faster and steeper than expected. For Japanese pilots trained to dominate turning combat, the experience is disorienting. Their greatest strength, tight maneuvering, feels irrelevant. Worse, it feels dangerous. Veteran pilots begin noticing patterns. The Hellcat does not commit to fights, it cannot win, it does not linger, it does not panic under fire. Even when hit, it remains controllable, stable, and aggressive. One pilot reports landing his Hellcat with dozens of holes in the airframe. Another returns with half a control surface missing. Both survive. Japanese pilots begin to realize something uncomfortable. They are no longer fighting equal machines. The Zero can still win if it catches a Hellcat slow, low, or distracted. But those opportunities are rare. American pilots are trained not to give them. Instructors on Japanese airfields struggle to adapt. They emphasize teamwork, ambush, discipline. They warn against reckless pursuit. But fuel shortages, pilot fatigue, and growing Allied numerical superiority limit what can be done. The Zero has not changed. The environment has. For the first time in the war, Japanese pilots are being forced to react rather than dictate. They are being pulled into fights on American terms. High-speed passes, vertical separations, brief windows of lethal fire. Confidence erodes. And once confidence fades, losses accelerate. The Hellcat is not just killing aircraft. It is killing certainty. By early 1944, the air war over the Pacific can be measured in numbers. And the numbers are brutal. The F6F Hellcat begins posting kill ratios that shock even its own commanders. Squadron after squadron reports the same outcome. Hellcats are returning damaged but intact, while Japanese aircraft are not returning at all. The Zero had once enjoyed ratios that bordered on the unbelievable. Now, the Hellcat reverses them. In some sectors, the exchange rate climbs to 10 Japanese aircraft lost for every Hellcat. In others, it is even worse. These are not flukes or lucky days. They are the result of a system working exactly as designed. The Hellcat's strength lies not in brilliance, but in consistency. American pilots no longer need to be aces to survive. They need discipline. They need to follow doctrine. The Hellcat gives them room to make mistakes and still live. Japanese pilots do not have that luxury. Fuel shortages limit training hours. Replacement pilots arrive with fewer flight hours and less combat seasoning. Veteran leaders are gone, killed earlier in the war when the Zero's edge was still enough to compensate. Now, the margin is gone. The Hellcat punishes hesitation and overcommitment. Zeros that turn too long lose energy and become targets. Zeros that dive too steeply risk structural failure. Zeros that take even a brief burst of .50 caliber fire often ignite instantly. American pilots notice how quickly fights end. There is no prolonged dogfighting, no circling contests, just a few seconds of violence, then separation, reset, and another pass. The Hellcat thrives in this environment. Carrier decks across the Pacific become factories of attrition. Hellcats launch, engage, return, refuel, rearm, and launch again. Maintenance crews patch holes, replace panels, and send aircraft back into the air within hours. Japanese airfields cannot keep pace. Each loss hurts more. Each experienced pilot killed removes irreplaceable knowledge. The Zero, once feared, becomes increasingly predictable. Pilots know what it can do, and more importantly, what it cannot. This is the real superiority of the Hellcat. Not speed alone, not firepower alone, but repeatability. The Hellcat allows the U.S. Navy to apply pressure relentlessly, day after day, battle after battle, without exhausting its pilots or its machines. By the time of the Marianas Campaign, the outcome is no longer in doubt. Japanese pilots still fight bravely, many fight skillfully, but they are flying an aircraft built for a war that has already passed. And the Hellcat is there to make sure they never catch up. June 1944, the Philippine Sea. By now, the Hellcat is no longer new. It is familiar, reliable, trusted. For American pilots launching from carrier decks before dawn, it feels less like a machine and more like armor with wings. For Japanese pilots, rising to meet them, it feels like inevitability. The battles over the Marianas will later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name sounds flippant. The reality is not. It is the moment when every advantage the Hellcat was designed to deliver arrives at once: training, doctrine, numbers, survivability, and raw lethality. Japanese aircraft rise to intercept in waves. They are met by Hellcats already at altitude. The Americans attack first. They dive through formations, firing briefly, then climb away. Zeros attempt to respond, but coordination breaks down almost immediately. Radio discipline falters. Pilots chase individually, trying to force fights that no longer exist. Hellcats do not oblige. They refuse the turn. They refuse to slow. They refuse to stay. A Japanese pilot lines up a shot and fires. He sees hits. He expects flame. Instead, the Hellcat keeps flying. Moments later, 50 caliber rounds tear through his aircraft. The Zero ignites. There is no recovery. This sequence repeats across the sky. What shocks Japanese commanders most is not just the losses, it is how uneventful they become. There are no dramatic duels, no drawn-out contests of skill. The Hellcats simply appear, strike, and vanish, leaving empty air and falling wreckage behind. American pilots return to their carriers with ammunition expended but fuel remaining. Aircraft are patched and sent back into the air the same day. The system absorbs damage and keeps functioning. Japanese air power collapses in hours. The Zero is still flying. It is still dangerous, but it is no longer relevant. By the end of the battle, the Japanese Navy has lost the core of its remaining carrier air arm. The Hellcat has not merely won a battle, it has erased an entire generation of opposing pilots. The shock is total. From this point forward, Japanese air operations become increasingly defensive, increasingly desperate. Kamikaze tactics will soon emerge, not because they are effective in a modern sense, but because conventional air combat has become unwinnable. The Hellcat has closed the door, and it has done so not with brilliance, but with ruthless efficiency. In the aftermath of the Marianas, the question is no longer what happened. It is why it happened so completely. The F6F Hellcat did not win because it was the fastest fighter in the sky. It did not win because it turned better than the Zero. In many ways, it did neither. It won because it was built for reality, not ideal conditions. American designers assumed pilots would make mistakes. They assumed aircraft would be hit. They assumed combat would be chaotic, unfair, and brutal. The Hellcat was engineered to survive that environment. Japanese design philosophy had assumed something else. The Zero was built for excellence in the hands of a perfect pilot. Light, agile, optimized for offense. That philosophy worked early, when Japanese pilots were highly trained and combat conditions favored maneuverability. But war does not stay ideal. As attrition mounted, Japan could not replace experienced pilots fast enough. New aviators entered combat with fewer hours, less confidence, and no margin for error. The Zero offered them none. The Hellcat did. American doctrine amplified this advantage. Pilots were taught to fight as part of a system. Radar warning, altitude control, mutual support, disciplined disengagement. Individual heroics were discouraged. Survival and repeatability were prized. The Hellcat fit that doctrine perfectly. It climbed when told, dived when needed, absorbed punishment, brought pilots home. Japanese pilots increasingly described the Hellcat as heavy but unstoppable. They found that even when they flew perfectly, outcomes no longer favored them. The fight had become mathematical, not personal. And mathematics favors the side that can repeat success. The Hellcat allowed American air power to scale. Thousands were built. Pilots transitioned into them quickly. Maintenance crews kept them flying under brutal conditions. Every part of the system reinforced every other part. By contrast, the Zero became increasingly isolated, a superb aircraft trapped in a collapsing ecosystem. By 1945, the Hellcat's kill tally would exceed 5,000 enemy aircraft, accounting for the majority of U.S. Navy air victories in the war. No other naval fighter comes close. Japanese pilots were not shocked by the Hellcat because it was mysterious. They were shocked because it worked exactly as intended. And intention, backed by industry and doctrine, is what decides wars. When the Pacific War ends, the F6F Hellcat does not become a legend in the romantic sense. It becomes something more important, a benchmark. In post-war reports, American officers do not describe the Hellcat with poetry. They describe it with numbers, charts, and outcomes. Sortie rates, loss ratios, pilot survivability, maintenance hours, mission success. And across every category, the conclusion is the same. The Hellcat worked. It worked not because it was perfect, but because it understood what air combat really was. Not a duel between aces, not a test of elegance or maneuver alone, but a sustained contest of endurance, discipline, and controlled violence. The Mitsubishi Zero is remembered with admiration even by its enemies. It was a masterpiece of early war design, brilliant, agile, and deadly in the hands of experts. But it represented a philosophy that could not survive prolonged war. The Hellcat represented the opposite. It assumed pilots would be tired. It assumed aircraft would be damaged. It assumed the enemy would adapt. And it was built to win anyway. Japanese pilots were shocked not because the Hellcat broke the rules, but because it rewrote them. It removed turning fights from the equation. It punished overcommitment. It rewarded restraint. It forced the enemy to fight on terms they could not sustain. By the time the last carrier battles are fought, the Zero is no longer feared. It is respected, but understood. And once an enemy is fully understood, the war is already decided. The Hellcat does not symbolize brilliance. It symbolizes maturity. The moment when American air power stopped reacting and started dictating, that is its real legacy. Not just a lethal fighter. But the machine that proved air combat is not won by the best aircraft on paper, but by the one designed for the war that actually arrives.